You have data everywhere, but is it working together? Meet Curator, the automotive industry's first unified intelligence engine. Curator unifies data from all corners of your dealership to transform marketing, sales, and customer interactions. See it today at gibagoo.com.
Welcome to this weekend drive edition of Daily Drive for the 5th week of August 2025. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. We're breaking down some of the biggest stories in the auto industry from the past week and looking forward to what's in store in the days ahead. Today, I'm joined by two of my automotive news colleagues. Michael Martinez covers Ford and the UAW. Mike, welcome back to Weekend Drive.
Thanks for having me.
And Molly Boigon covers tech and innovation for automotive news. Molly, welcome back.
Thanks, Cal.
All right, so let's get started. So our own Richard Truitt reported earlier this week about a possible bombshell in the EU's trade framework with the U.S. One sentence in the document seems to say that the U.S. and EU would accept each other's vehicle safety and emission standards under a deal. Now, Mike, what are some of the potential issues, and could this result in lower safety and environmental protections?
Well, Kel, there's about 1,000,001 potential issues here. There's a lot we don't really know, although I still think this is absolutely fascinating and a potential massive development, right? Because for so long, groups have been trying to harmonize the standards between the US and Europe. It costs automakers hundreds of millions of dollars to retrofit, to modify their vehicles if they want to export them, to sell them in the different markets. The safety standards, the emission standards are so different. I think here in the US, we care more about the drivers, the people actually in the vehicles. Europe sort of cares more about the pedestrians in case of a crash. So if a Ford or a GM wants to export a big truck, say, they need to add things like external airbags or collapsible hoods. If Europeans are trying to import vehicles here, they need to add beefier bumpers and more sensors, especially for rear end collisions, because we seem to care more about that. The emissions are different. So if the automakers don't have to spend all that money modifying their vehicles and the same standards are accepted, it could, I think the jargony term is a non-tariff barrier to trade. This is a non-tariff barrier to trade. If you take that away, there could be more incentive to see more F-150s or Silverados on the Autobahn. But the question is, do people actually want that? I don't know. You saw a decade ago when Sergio Marchionne tried to bring Fiat to the US. They did not sell well at all. Those smaller European cars, obviously there was a lot of issues there in terms of the emissions regulations. They were losing money on every car they sold. So, different situation today. But the question remains, do Americans want European cars? Do Europeans want American cars? Who knows? Who knows how exactly these regulations will play out? But if it all works out, it sort of levels that playing field. It reduces some cost and time for the car companies. And in theory, it would make customers happier because they'll have more choice. And that's always a good thing.
Well, Mike, how might automakers redesign cars to meet both the US and EU markets?
Well, that's the thing. They wouldn't have to redesign their cars, and they wouldn't have to spend all that money modify these sort of third-party modifiers wouldn't have to become involved. Customers wouldn't have to pay all that extra money. So that would be the game changer, Kel, is that you could, in theory, if this all works out how we think it might, you could sell an F-150, a Ram 1500 without much change. You could bring in, for the American market, this could be important. You could bring in smaller European cars in an age where affordability is an issue. Range, even for gas vehicles, is important. People want to go further on a tank of gas because it can cost a lot of money to fill up. They may be more likely to buy those smaller vehicles. And again, you wouldn't need to change too much.
Well, we usually don't think of Ford as a major exporter to Europe, but how could this affect Ford also?
Well, it depends on what model you're talking about, right? The Mustang sells well anywhere in the world where it's sold. But, again, it could give Ford more incentive to shop its larger products in more markets. They obviously have plenty of plants in Europe and elsewhere overseas that serve those markets. But, you could see, in theory, I don't know if you'll see too many F-350s, F-450s rolling down these sort of very old and small roads in Germany
Cobblestone
or France
streets.
or wherever. Yeah, that doesn't make much sense, but in theory, they could have an easier time selling them, and if that's what people want, so be it.
Interesting. Now, Molly, if listeners think they finally got a handle on which auto parts are affected by tariffs, you wrote a story this week that will probably completely burst their bubble. You write that more auto parts may soon be added to the list. Now, why will parts manufacturers be able to request components to be added to the tariff list, and how will they do this?
That's right. I hate to burst people's bubbles, but there was a provision of the original auto parts tariff proclamation that the government would release a procedure for auto parts manufacturers to be able to add tariffs to the list, and specifically to add parts to the list of components or goods receiving tariffs. So the reason why the government did this is because it's creating an avenue for manufacturers who feel like maybe an important product for which the US has a competitive disadvantage has been left off the list. It's an opportunity for those manufacturers to try and sort of seek extra protection for their own operations.
Now, what impact will this have on the auto industry?
So the procedure was published. The government still has to publish it in the Federal Register, and there will be periodic 2-week windows whereby manufacturers can submit ideas to the government for new parts to be added to the tariff schedule. However, the government's been delayed in posting that to the Federal Register, so we haven't seen any of this yet. For me, I think the thing that this will really highlight is the different ways that parts manufacturers versus vehicles manufacturers are thinking about the tariffs. The vehicle manufacturers are eating a lot of the tariff cost and thinking about basically how to keep costs down and manage those extra expenses. And then you have this procedure highlighting the ways in which auto parts manufacturers may be actually seeking to add additional parts to the list and sort of protect their own operations and manufacturing from foreign competition. So I think it may, if parts manufacturers take the government up on this offer, sort of highlight the tension around that dynamic.
Kel, I would just have one thing to add, that I cannot wait to see the ramifications of this, because the pettiness is going to be off the charts. And
Yeah,
you see that with the automakers,
right.
right? And you talk about Ford and GM, these two Detroit rivals. There were some strong insinuations that it was GM who was sort of lobbying against what Ford was doing with its Marshall battery plant, using sort of Chinese technology, and they were running into some roadblocks. There were some rumblings that GM was the one alerting the government and cautioning the government against what Ford was doing. So I can only imagine what automakers, what rival suppliers will do to try to get that leg up on each other when these rules, when they're allowed to, submit this stuff to the government.
That's a really good point. And interestingly, the original tariff proclamation said the government would create a process for auto parts manufacturers, vehicle manufacturers, and industry groups to submit these goods for consideration to be added to the tariff schedule. The procedure only is for auto parts manufacturers at this point. So I think that I don't know for sure, this is purely conjecture, but I think Mike raises a really good point that perhaps the government is still working out ways to prevent intercompany competition from sort of bleeding into this process. So they're holding off on the procedure for the auto parts manufacturers.
This is so interesting. I feel like this whole auto parts tariffs thing, this could turn into a really, really good Netflix documentary. Jeez Louise. Thanks, guys. So coming up, as part of our centennial celebration this week at Automotive News, Mike took a look at our coverage of labor and the UAW over the past 100 years. We'll talk about that next on Weekend Drive.
Daily Drive listeners like you have access to the lowest price for Automotive News Congress 2025 on September 11th.
The event is where the industry's biggest players tackle its toughest challenges. Congress attendees don't just follow the industry, they lead it.
This year's featured speakers include Hyundai Motor Group Executive Chair Yu-Sung Chung, Asbury Automotive CEO David Holt, and General Motors CEO Mary Barra.
We are investing in America. We're creating jobs. That's creating IP in this country. And I think, the United States needs to lead in key technologies.
Join us to gain the insights and connections needed to steer your business through massive change.
To get the lowest price for the event, go to autonews.com/events, select Auto News Congress, and type in the discount code Daily Drive. That's one word, all caps, Daily Drive. And we'll see you on September 11th in Detroit.
Your dealership has no shortage of customer information. But when that data is conflicting, messy, and spread across a multitude of platforms, it's impossible to activate properly. As the automotive industry's first unified intelligence engine, Curator enriches and unifies your customer data across platforms, like your CRM, your DMS, your website, and even your marketing efforts. It then injects that information back into your most vital systems to provide a single view of each customer and equip your sales team with the information they need to close a deal. When one of the largest volume Subaru dealers in the country wanted to tap into its data goldmine, they turned to Curator. In just 4 months, Huberger Subaru experienced a 55% higher closing ratio and a return of 15 times their investment. Want to see it for yourself? Check out the case study at gubagoo.com/curator. That's GUBAGOO.com/curator.
Welcome back to Weekend Drive. I'm Kellen Walker with Automotive News staff reporters Molly Boigon and Mike Martinez. Mike, you wrote a piece this week about our coverage of the UAW and labor movements over the past century as part of Automotive News' 100th birthday, which we celebrated this week. When you went back through our issues from decades ago, what were some of the things that stood out to you about our coverage of the early days of the UAW?
Yeah, Kel, it was honestly pretty wild to see how Automotive Daily News at the time covered the UAW. The first mention of it was 2 days after its founding. It was a Wednesday, August 28th, 1935. There was a 2-sentence brief in the bottom right-hand corner of the paper. It did make the front page, but barely. Thought that was interesting. And it quoted somebody as saying this union was meant to help employees share in the wealth of the industry. But, I'll be honest with you, it seemed in those early days we were a little slanted in our coverage, and I hate to say it, I'm a proud employee here, but it was really geared more towards the companies in those early days. The famous Battle of the Overpass, where future president of the UAW, Walter Reuther, and some union members were attempting to pass out flyers near Ford's Rouge plant. They were beaten up pretty severely by company goons, security guards, Harry Bennett and others, within an inch of their life, basically, in some instances for some of these people. The only mention of the Battle of the Overpass in Automotive News was a few days later. Small story on page 2. The headline was Ford production normal despite UAW disturbance.
Wow.
And we quoted Henry Ford blaming the issue on newspaper sensationalism. So fake news was a thing.
That
even
was
back
a
then.
thing.
There were a whole lot of communist fear mongering, I think is the best way to put it, during the Flint sit down strike. There was a photo we ran one day of one of the strikers, and one had their fist in the air. So the caption in all caps was, "Is this Moscow?" So there were some interesting findings, but it did go to show you our coverage has evolved, but the union has played a major role in the industry, for its 90 years.
You also touched on how the industries played a role even outside the auto industry. What were some of the highlights that you were able to find there?
Yeah, Molly, it's really interesting because basically a lot of the things we even enjoy as journalists, or most workers enjoy, no matter what sector you're in, you can trace it back to the UAW or a union that had to fight, sometimes literally, to win that benefit for you. And I'm talking pensions, healthcare, paid time off, weekends free, a certain set number of hours, annual raises. Those are all things the UAW won in its early contracts with the Detroit Three after the fights to become recognized there. And even beyond the auto industry, it played an important role shaping American politics. early civil rights issues. Walter Reuther spoke at the March on Washington, where MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech. The UAW was prominent in its support of Nelson Mandela in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Nelson Mandela came to Detroit in 1990. He got a UAW card. He had one of those fancy satin jackets with the UAW wheel on it, and he thanked the union. So its impact has really extended beyond the industry in terms of benefits, but also just in terms of social impact issues.
Yeah, and some of those issues came into stark relief during the Great Recession of 2009. How did that impact the union, and did it ever fully recover from some of those challenges?
The short answer is no, because the union had to give up a lot to help the companies remain financially solvent. Obviously, Chrysler and GM still went bankrupt despite what the UAW did. There were a lot of givebacks from what it had gained over the years. And you can argue whether or not some of that stuff was fair or good for a business whose job it is to make money to have. There was one of the most controversial elements is the jobs bank. That was a benefit the UAW, I think it was 84 when they won that. Essentially, if you were laid off, an auto worker who was laid off, you could still make almost your entire paycheck. You get thrown into this jobs bank and you basically sat around and twiddled your thumbs and got your full paycheck almost for being laid off. Probably not the best thing to have if you're a business. The union had to get rid of it. They're still trying to win it back today. The chances aren't that great, honestly. But then you look at things like different tiers of workers, new hires getting paid significantly less than legacy workers. Those new hires no longer receiving pensions. The older workers still got them. The elimination of cost of living adjustments. So we just saw in 2023, the union win some of that back. Not all of it, but some of it. So to this day, they are still fighting to recover from what they lost. But you could argue, did they need everything back then? If you're a Ford or a GM, you're probably way better off to not have those sort of burdensome costs on your books.
Well, Mike, this question right here was coming because we cannot talk about the UAW without mentioning the corruption scandal. The 2017 federal investigation exposed numerous union officials. Now, has its members regained the trust of new union leadership under Shawn Fain?
I'm not sure that they have, largely because of some controversy under Shawn Fain. The result of that corruption scandal was that the UAW was placed under a 6-year consent decree with oversight from a federal monitor. And that monitor is looking into some personnel choices Shawn Fain made, and stripping a secretary treasurer and a VP of some key assignments. And the perception, I think, is still there that, hey, maybe this union isn't necessarily clean. Now, obviously, there's been no criminal allegations against Shawn Fain. A lot of what the monitor is looking at is still under investigation, but just the perception that everything isn't on the up and up still hurts some members. There was a lot of trust lost in that corruption scandal. 2 presidents went to jail.
Wow.
It was the worst thing you could think of, because what was found to have happened was that these criminals were stealing money from the members, sacred dues money, to fund this lavish lifestyle. Thousands of dollars in cigars and fancy golf trips in Palm Springs, and this really expensive liquor and I remember Mont Blanc pens were part of this at some point. So the union's all about solidarity. It's all about being there for your brothers and sisters. And to have that betrayal of trust was really, really tough on the membership, and it's going to take a long time to gain back that trust.
Wow. Well, good stuff. Molly, Mike, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Cal.
Thanks.
That's all for this Weekend Drive edition of Daily Drive. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer for his help on today's podcast. You can get the latest news on the UAW, tariffs, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. We'll be off for the Labor Day holiday on Monday, but join us Tuesday for a conversation with Anshuman Saxena, who leads development of ADAS and autonomous driving products for Qualcomm.
It has been a pretty nice journey in Qualcomm, building up step by step the bricks that we have put for the foundation for driver assistance systems and automated driving.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. If you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.